I need to make something clear. I am not a music theorist. I quit playing piano when I was 11. I think most people would agree with me, though, that a key element of music, or art period, is repetition. Art is a language, and repetition is the essence of that language. And whether we're conducting an orchestra, composing a shot in a film, or applying paint to a canvas, repetition provides a pattern with which to ground our expectations. And it is the provision and satisfaction of those expectations that makes music pleasant. A well-composed melody or hook catches us, eagerly anticipating the next note even if we've never heard the song before. So by that logic, creating original music means finding creative patterns of repetition. And if we consider the world of experimental music, there are two broad approaches. One way is to emphasize repetition, the cornerstone of minimalist composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass. Another way is to do away with repetition altogether and emphasize the parts of music that do not cohere or repeat, genres that eschew melody entirely and dive headlong into discord. But here's my question. What if we did both? Can music both emphasize repetition while also detracting from it? Yes. And the best example of such art happens to be the product of pure serendipity. It's also possibly some of the most poignant and informative music of the past 2 decades. Music that reminds us of the impermanence of not just art, but all of nature, and the lessons this fact can teach us about our history and our future. What you're listening to are the opening moments of Track 1 of The Disintegration Loops, the brainchild of American composer William Basinski. Often considered a masterpiece of ambient music, The Disintegration Loops spans roughly 5 hours, filling up 5 CDs and 9 vinyl records. Its reputation, however, may puzzle you at first. In fact, you may be unimpressed by what sounds like the same sample of muffled brass instruments repeating over and over, even if it works perfectly fine as a piece of ambience. But as the minutes pass and the sample repeats, you start to hear little shots of error. Horn flourishes don't sound as crisp. The mix begins to stutter almost, which later develops into full-blown distortion. Until by the very end, you hear this. This is what I mean when I say that Basinski's music both does and doesn't repeat. The basis of this track is one sample, but each time it repeats, it has marginally decayed. This is contrary to most songs which make you expect the next note, and when it comes, it just hits because it meets our expectations. When we listen to the Disintegration Loops, however, that expectation is perpetually unsatisfied. We expect the previous loop, but get slightly less. And before you know it, the track has shifted from a muffled orchestra to a few reverberated knocks. The opening track itself is an hour long, so the constraints of this essay can't really replicate the experience of sitting through what sounds like the continuous unraveling of this sample. What's fascinating about the Disintegration Loops, though, is that this decay is not some special effect or the product of synthesis. It is the sound of actual decay. You see, Basinski makes music by manipulating fragments of obsolete recording equipment. In particular, he uses tapes. Before he started making the disintegration loops, he had been taking old tape music and digitizing it. These tapes were mostly second-hand music that had been collecting dust in his apartment, and in order to convert these tapes to digital, he had to run them through a digitizer. However, as he began doing this, something curious started happening. Some of these tapes were so old that as they passed over the tape head, the magnetic film on them was slowly shaved off. And Basinski just let the tape continue playing, each pass scraping off a bit more of the film, and thus the music contained within it. What resulted was a digital recording that reflects this process of analog decay, something that is hypnotizing while remaining almost totally contrary to how we traditionally understand and experience music. Something is always missing from the loops, and you don't even notice till it's gone. It never fully repeats itself. Now, I mentioned that the disintegration loops is significant because not only is it both compelling and innovative as a piece of music, but it is also the product of chance. An example of an artist having a perfect idea practically fall into their lap and seizing it without hesitation. But this serendipity doesn't stop at the music itself, because that would be ignoring the point in time Basinski happened to be processing these tapes. At the time of recording, Basinski was living in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, his rooftop looking straight across the East River at the Manhattan skyline. And a month after Basinski finished recording the disintegration loops, something happened that would change that skyline forever.
Coast in the Midwest, but we're joined by the entire network just to show you some pictures at the foot of New York City. This is at the World Trade Center, that a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and you.
And then all of a sudden, I thought it sounded kind of louder. Then I looked up, and all of a sudden, it smashed right.
Kind of an effort up there, yeah. Now remember, oh my God.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
I watched the plane fly into the World Trade Center.
A United Airlines flight, 175 out of Boston.
We don't know if something happened, another explosion.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
Trade Center, the other tower of the World Trade Center has just collapsed. You are
Black. Oh my God, there it goes! Get out of
here! For my generation, I don't think there's an event that divides history into before and after, quite like the September 11th attacks. I was just shy of 6 when it happened, but it wasn't until I was older that I realized what it truly represented. Following the end of the Cold War, many Westerners began to see the new decade ahead of them as a time of unprecedented peace, when we had ostensibly defeated all the bad guys, and the only enemy left was our daily commute to work. Some even claimed that we had reached the end of history. Of course, this sense of stability was not felt all over the world. But when 9/11 happened, our collective sense of safety suddenly felt like a lie. It ushered in the 2000s the same way the fall of the Berlin Wall had ushered in the 1990s. But while the latter created an illusion of progress and stability, 9/11 tore that illusion asunder. In total, just under 3,000 people died in the attacks, and Ground Zero became a festering concrete wound in a now traumatized Manhattan. The cleanup effort in New York alone cost at least $33 billion, and the attacks marked a dramatic shift in public policy that's still felt to this day. But for the purposes of this video, what really interests me is what the attacks meant for the buildings themselves. The World Trade Center wasn't just some skyscraper. It was as much a part of New York's image as the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. To see it vanish into thin air would be like seeing Big Ben or the Eiffel Tower meeting a similar fate. Notoriety aside, watching something like the World Trade Center collapse is shocking because we understand intuitively that the time it took to fall was a fraction of the time taken to construct it. Events like 9/11 are so traumatizing because we as individuals are constitutionally unable to handle that much change. Old age, sickness, and death are hard enough for us to process when they happen at their own pace. What's more, however, is that despite being an architectural marvel in a city with no shortage of icons, The real legacy of the World Trade Center would only be determined in its destruction. The might of something as big as the Twin Towers added to them a sense of permanence that made their annihilation all the more shocking. Of course, this was not the first time humans had had that sort of hubris, but we didn't know what the World Trade Center really meant to us until it was a cloud of dust. What really endured was left behind when it was gone. And on that morning, as he watched the attacks unfold from Brooklyn, Basinski placed a camcorder on his rooftop and just let it run, all the while blaring his new record from the rooftops. Still frames of that footage would become the cover art for the disintegration loops. Because Basinski had found a link between that cloud of dust and the record he had just finished. A record where you only fully appreciate each track after a piece of it has faded away. He didn't want a hook that let us take the sound for granted. Similarly, as a symbol of his city turned into one of fear and terror, Basinski's record would come to symbolize how we would come to terms with that. But we could not have reached this conclusion without losing something in the process. Long ago, in what's now northern India, a man became enlightened after sitting in meditation beneath a Bodhi tree for 49 days, the culmination of an arduous spiritual journey. That man was Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who, seeking truth, escaped the luxurious cloisters of his family's palace. While traveling, he came across a sight that would change his life forever. An old man, a sick man, and a dead man. Faced at once with the inevitable facts of aging, illness, and death, Gautama couldn't have received a more brutal reality check. He renounced everything, turning to a life of poverty that eventually found him beneath the Bodhi tree. And at the end of that meditation, Gautama was no longer a man. He had become a Buddha. Obviously, as Buddhism is the religion of 500 million people, how it is practiced varies greatly from one place to another. But if there's one thing that pretty much all Buddhists can agree on, it's the Four Noble Truths, something we all probably learned in social studies and then forgot about after regurgitating it onto a test. No piece of scripture crystallizes Gautama's insight quite like the Four Noble Truths. In particular, the first noble truth: life is suffering. This statement might confuse you at first. While they're better known in the West for peace, compassion, and good vibes, this statement alone might bring you to the conclusion that Buddhists are a bunch of doomers. My response to that would be to get a better translator. You see, the Four Noble Truths and the original scriptures attributed to the Buddha's word were written in a liturgical language called Pali, and in the original truth, the word used is dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, but is closer to something like dissatisfaction. And herein lies the real truth. For Buddhists, the problem is less that life sucks and more that life is never really enough. Our universe is in a constant state of flux. Everything we experience, including our own sense of identity, is transient. Things go as soon as they come. That's a tough pill to swallow when you're an organism whose number one imperative is to continue existing, or at least pass your genes down to the next generation. And to make matters worse for humans in particular, our brains evolved to give us unparalleled powers of reason and self-awareness, which makes the fact of our own mortality feel all the more palpable. Humans are, of course, not the only organisms that display self-awareness, but you don't see dolphins writing books lamenting how self-aware they are. The very part of us that allows us to love and build ziggurats and write video essays is also the source of a suffering that is quite possibly unique to humans. But we're still animals. We cling for dear life to the part of us that wants to make babies and feel physically secure and stable. And with those parts of us come some very enticing reward mechanisms. As painful as it is, desire feels natural, especially since resisting it feels so unnatural. But according to the Buddha, this sense of comfort is a delusion that stems from a failure to accept the nature of our experience. Thankfully, we may liberate ourselves from this delusion if we find the courage within ourselves to accept the transient nature of existence, to let go of this evolutionary rat race. and rediscover our inner peace that was obscured by our cravings, but which was nonetheless always there.
Because you're right, Reuben. The world does keep moving. It can be a damn cruel place. But for me, those moments of stillness, that place, that's the kingdom of God. And that place will never abandon you.
When faced with a catastrophe like 9/11, there is a lesson in both Basinski's music and the Buddha's teachings that may help us cope. I began this video talking about how music is based on repetition. We like music because it repeats. We get pumped up during the verse because we're eagerly anticipating that chorus. It's called a hook for a reason. But then you have Buddhism, which tells us that essentially nothing really repeats. No two moments are alike because a moment is a birth and a death all at once. You can play that song over again, but will it really be as good as the first time? Will we really be happy holding on to a million little pasts? This is not to say that we should be passive in the face of suffering, especially when that suffering is at the hands of other humans. Acceptance does not mean resigning oneself to fate, but it does mean acknowledging suffering within and without, which is a scary task. But when we feel it out, when we stop running, when we stop clinging, when we look the world and ourselves square in the face, we eventually find the peace needed to truly move forward.